We're so glad you're with us today with George Leopold, a space writer, biographer of Gus Grissom. Welcome, George.
Hey, great to be with you, Mark.
Yeah, well, great to finally meet you. You were in the building this week with Matthew Bedingfield.
Yep.
You can tell us about what you two are up to there, interviewing Gary Allgaier, a resource of information.
Yeah, boy.
So you're on this. What are you doing here with you and Matthew? And
Well, everybody asks, when you do a book, what are you working on next? Matthew and I are working on the Apollo 1 fire. We think that there's a gap in space history that needs to be filled there. And we have sort of a unique approach in that Matthew's grandfather is James Gleaves, the lead pad technician on Pad 34 on the evening of the Apollo 1 fire. He's never said much about that experience in 50 years, and we're slowly getting details from him. Great guy.
He's got to be in his 90s, right?
Yeah, early 90s, really sharp.
So he was one of the guys, his name was left on the badge up there, and people knew that he and a dozen other guys were on that level of where the spacecraft was.
When the call of fire came out, Don Babbitt, the pad leader on level A8, said, "Get him out of there." And that was the effort that Jim Gleaves led.
Jim Gleaves?
Gleaves. Gleaves,
Gleaves, yeah. Well, many of you that have been at the Space Center have seen that board of names up there.
Yeah,
and
right.
The wonderful Apollo 1 tribute there. I'm getting my smartphone on here so we can take your questions. We appreciate everybody watching today. Yes, you know that I have had COVID and have gotten over it. Marty also got it, and I had to call him in to help Selvin get our board straightened out here a little bit today. Selvin is always willing to help us, but he's got other duties, and thank you for being here, Selvin, today. Let me pull up our broadcast here on Marty also there. I can hear my name there. All right, we're talking. So if I can't get the comments going here, we'll have Selvin take your questions there. But we're going to have a great conversation with George here, a person that I've known a little bit, heard talk about. Don't know anything about this book. There's your handsome picture there for your book there. And here's the book that we're going to talk a little about. Calculated Risks, The Supersonic Life and Times of Gus Grissom. That's a whole lot in that title there.
Yeah.
To any space geek that knows about Gus Grissom.
Yeah, I mean, the theme of risk is important here. That these guys are putting their hides on the line, and they try to minimize those risks before they fly, and when they think they're ready, they go.
And we're going to talk about this here in a few minutes because a big risk was taken last night, overnight, of the first commercial spacewalk by the Polaris Dawn crew. Kudos to them, huh?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, though it was a stand-up EVA and nothing like the pictures that were shown earlier of them out on a tether.
Wasn't quite Ed White, but it's a good first step.
Yeah, and you know, I'm glad to see a private company taking baby steps.
Yeah.
All right. That was the philosophy of the Mercury, Gemini, Apollo program. Test out everything in increments.
Build out each flight. Yeah.
I'm not going to say SpaceX has done any shortcuts because they certainly have worked through things too. But you must follow a very safe pattern when you're going to outer space, George, right?
Yep. Every mission builds on the previous one, and you try to push the envelope as you think you safely can.
So interesting to watch that with people can comment on that. We're going to talk about right now, parked at the International Space Station are 6 spacecraft, all right? You wondered where Soyuz MS-26 was going to fit in there. When we talk about this frequently. This is a NASA graphic that shows where spacecraft are. But right there is the empty port that Starlink
Right.
Well, Starliner was on.
Finally.
Starliner was on there. There's the Crew 8 Dragon.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So the Crew 9 crew to be launched Tuesday will park right there with Nick Hague and a Russian on board there. Just two people because they're going to bring Sonny and Butch back.
Ah, okay. I didn't realize they were going up this soon. Okay.
Yep. It's Tuesday. Nick Hague's got a very interesting story, George. He survived an abort to orbit. An abort of a Soyuz spacecraft.
Oh, okay. I remember, yeah.
Wow. And they got up about 70 miles and came back down.
Anybody who can live and talk about that.
Well, you know what? The other cosmonaut with him is on the space station right now.
Oh, really?
It was launched on the Soyuz 26 crew.
Funny.
How cool is that?
Yeah.
I'm going to talk about that. Two guys that
Nice.
survived an abort in a Soyuz spacecraft are now, or will be Tuesday, together on the International Space Station. And of course, you stay curious. You know I'm going to talk about that. We got the MS-25 crewed spaceship that Tracy Dyson took up with two cosmonauts that returned quickly, and she's going to return with two other cosmonauts, including Konyenko, who spent over 1,100 days in space,
Right.
The longest of anybody. And then you got the Progress and the Cygnus, our cargo ships up there.
Right.
So,
Right.
and of course, yesterday we were breaking the news that 19 humans were orbiting Earth
You had it first.
at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon yesterday. And I'm glad everybody's caught on to that. Not that they wouldn't know about that, but this is the most humans who've ever been in orbit of the Earth since all eternity, as former voice of NASA Hugh Harris would say about certain spectacular things like that. George, you're a baby boomer like me.
That's right.
Only 620 humans have orbited the Earth since Yuri Gagarin.
Never did we think
And I
we'd
thought
be
it'd be
saying-
a lot more than that 50 years, 60
Yeah.
years later.
Well,
But
yeah.
it kind of shows you how hard it is again, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Space is hard. It's dangerous. And
79 women of those 620 humans. We celebrate them in our women's gallery here. So this was not planned, folks. And we're not talking about when Virgin Galactic had 6 people up in suborbital flight, and I
Right.
think there was 20 people weightlessness for 5 minutes.
yeah.
We're talking about orbiting the Earth. They've all been living, had meals, gone to the bathroom, all that good stuff up there, in the last day or two. And of course, Polaris Dawn launched Monday, Tuesday morning, then Soyuz MS-25 launched yesterday. Added to that with Butch and Sonny there, 3 Tachionauts on their heavenly palace.
We were at Cape Canaveral this morning, and we're pretty sure we saw the booster coming back in from Monday's launch.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. That's
Yeah.
always good to see there. All right, I'm looking for my smart tablet. I'm not getting the names on stuff like here. I don't know what's going on with me, but I'm going to keep efforting that. But if somebody's chiming in on there, Selvin, please let me know, because I know there's some friends of George out there that might have a question for him or two. And I am baffled to why I can't get the comments. And I was playing around with it the other day, but we'll get to that later. So what's important is we got a great show here for you today. Thank you, Marty Winkel, for coming in and bailing us out. He masked up. He's about 2 days away from testing negative on that COVID, and it just gave me a big head cold. But now I can taste my tang in my Dave Stangy Detroit cup. He's up there near the Motor City.
Cheers.
So
To your health.
cheers.
To your health.
Thank you. We had a German tour guide group in here
Oh,
yesterday, 17 of them. So
really?
we get a lot of
That's excellent.
tourists through the Space Coast Office of Tourism brings in these groups of travel agents, and so I whipped up a little tang for them and some cookies,
There you go.
and they all are mystified by tang, but it's still out there. You can find it in the grocery store.
I've got some on the shelf.
Do you?
Oh yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a friend found it, and I haven't opened it. It's a museum piece.
Well, George, you're a space historian like so many of our friends watching today, like Mitch Rothman. Hello to Mitch out there. We've got some great viewership out here that really know their stuff. So if you do have a question, please bring it on. And once again, not sure why I must have some setting wrong, George, or something.
I've done that.
I used to be able to see the questions on here. So you got them on yours? Okay, thank you, Selvin. I don't know what the heck I'm doing there. So we want to say hi to, there's Mitch on there. He says, great to see me back. Appreciate that. Dean Babcock, he's a knowledgeable space fan. Gary Gerald loves space, and he's a Vidalia onion and peanut farmer up in Collins, Georgia.
Good for him.
And we've interviewed him about GPS technology and farming.
Yeah.
Very important.
Oh, yeah.
Tom Celentano, thank you, Tom. Great to be missed. Carlton Bailey says howdy to all of us. And yes, Crew 9 is a week from Tuesday. Thank you, Neil 1030. I was thinking Tuesday, but it's the 24th.
Yeah.
It's a mid-afternoon flight, too. So I think around 2:30 in the afternoon. And Tommy Usiak, hello to you. Tom Usiak, in 1992, I believe, was photographing STS-47, Mae Jemison, first African-American woman, and the first Japanese man, Moya, went up. And you were there to photograph that, Tommy. And that's what I was going to talk about today until George texted me and said he was available. And I said, of course, I'm scrapping everything I have planned to get a good guest like this in here. So I know you're going to enjoy what George has to share. He is the primary biographer of the great Gus Grissom. And we're going to talk about that here in a brief few minutes, but we love space history. In 1966, there's a hypergolic engines of that Titan rocket, not an ICBM on top of it, but the crew of Apollo 11, or Gemini 11,
Right.
Flying to space on this date in history. Pete Conrad and Dick Gordon. And I know you know your space history. These were two wild and crazy guys, weren't they?
I met them both, and they were both crazy. Yeah.
Smart, but boy, did they have a lot of fun together.
If you can't be good, be colorful.
That's what Pete said. The third man on the moon, kind of hurt that he was looked over that by Neil. It was a big close, whether it was going to be Neil or Pete Conrad be the first one.
Mm-hmm.
Always can tell Pete because of his gap in his tooth there, of course. Dick Gordon, they were at the Naval Academy together. And then they picked up another rookie Naval Academy member, Al Bean, and went to the moon together.
The artist.
Yeah, the artist. And this has to be one of the most cohesive, brotherly crew of any crew that ever flown. Don't you think?
They were tight. They were tight.
And the stories of Dick Gordon, oh my gosh, after his astronaut career, heard a few around here. He lived into his 80s. Tragically, Conrad died in a motorcycle accident in 1999 at age 69. As BMW went off the road in some gravel, and though he got up and so forth, I guess it ruptured his spleen, and he was in a very rural hospital that didn't know.
Out in California.
Yeah, it was really bad. So, but these guys were living in glory today. They set the record of 850 miles above the Earth. There's a paver that we celebrate that at Gemini Spaceview Park. Of course, that record was broken yesterday by Polaris Dawn. What do you think of the little Spaceview Park we have out there?
Beautiful, beautiful. We walked around the other day. We're looking for Matthew's grandfather's name on some of the plaques, and it's very well done. The prints, the handprints are really special. I think they really bring it alive.
Yeah, it's truly, to me, a one-of-a-kind place in the world, like the Eiffel Tower, the Roman Colosseum, really, the Taj Mahal. The only place you can put your handprints on some of these heroes of ours growing up on there. Got Doug Forrest says hello from Los Angeles, and Terrence Jokobus. outer space at Earth. Well, he's got a question off the subject here, but is it possible to build a generational spacecraft in outer space at Earth orbit? Well, Terrence, I suppose someone will figure it out somewhere down the line. That was the von Braun plan. Was
yeah,
to build
that was
things.
Earth orbit rendezvous.
Yeah, and build things in there. So glad to have you with us, Terrence Jokobus. Stay curious, and like myself, we'll learn a lot of good things on there. What I like about Jared Isaacman, and the Polaris Dawn is they came up with an emblem mimicking the 1966 mission patch of Conrad and Gordon. How cool is that?
Nice.
I mean, they got it to the T. They took all the artwork and matched it up there, and I love it when today's rocket renaissance companies remember the legacies that they stand on.
They're standing on the shoulders of giants.
Absolutely.
Right. Yep.
Here is Dick Gordon, ride 'em cowboy, he said, going over to an Agena rocket that their spacecraft was attached. They went up to about 850 miles, and the Polaris Dawn got up to 870 something yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
Then they came down to like a 450-mile orbit, still twice as high as the space station is right now.
Yeah.
And there's Isaacman. I got up and down during the night because it was supposed to be 2:38.
I
and
caught the
finally,
end of it this morning.
Yeah, about 5:30 in the morning they did it. Each Isaacman and then Sarah Gillis, a SpaceX employee who helped design these spacesuits. They each took turns for about 10 minutes just standing up. They didn't let go of the spacecraft. They didn't float around on their tether. I was kind of glad to see that, George.
Yeah, incremental step.
Yeah, it's just so risky.
Make sure those new suits work.
We're in a generation where video games, are the thing, and and there's a whole generation that grew up with them. You and I aren't that generation, and sometimes they act like space is a video game.
Yeah.
But to see them being so cautious, testing this suit out, he's flexing an arm there to test the joints on there. It was fascinating to see him inside the spacecraft and him taking out the hatch. And I was wondering about what that tube looked like that's got their air and communications in it.
It's amazing that you get the live video from inside, outside, all these different views. That's really good for engaging audiences. And the cabin repressurization process, I caught a little bit of that, and they took that very slowly. And you want to make sure there's a tight seal on that hatch before they take their helmets off.
That's right. You had the two other occupants of the Polaris Dawn. Let me go back there and get their names off that. Poteet was the male, and Menon, the lady named Menon.
Mm-hmm.
She also is a SpaceX employee that did this spacesuit design. It was an engineer on it. They were just sitting back, but they were exposed to the elements of space the first time ever 4 human beings have been exposed to space. All right, like that, and so their spacesuits had to be just as worthy as that, and they were holding the hoses and all that stuff. So, I got to thinking about that later, George, about the engineering of this. Each one of them had to be a life support system of its own.
Right. I don't think their own separate space.
I don't think that it was like a vacuum cleaner and 4 hoses coming out of it,
right.
Type of thing. But also, the spacecraft interior is exposed to the elements of outer space.
Yes.
And as we know, those computers in there have to be cooled down.
Yeah.
And so this was exposed to a different environment than was. So there was more to this than meets the eye.
This was not a vacuum chamber test. Yeah.
Yeah. And apparently all nominal. They're going to spend today and tomorrow in space and come down Friday morning, I believe. So come down tomorrow morning.
A good first step.
Yeah, absolutely. Thought I'd throw in there. Was technically a SEVA, stand-up extravehicular activity, SEVA. There's a term for that. And then the two inside were on a IEVA, an internal EVA.
Yeah.
that's been done on the Mir space station, and to salvage the Spectrum module that got hit by a cargo ship.
Yeah, Wally Schirra actually said after the Apollo 1 fire that we actually had a name for, because we could move around in the Apollo cabin, inter intervehicular.
Yeah, intervehicular. Yeah, that's what I meant.
Exercise.
Yeah,
Yeah,
intervehicular
it was
EVA.
it was a thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a thing. It still is a thing. So
Mhm.
there is 94-year-old Buzz Aldrin. Now he's not 94 there, of course. This is his spacewalk stand-up EVA on Gemini 12. Very important mission for proving the spacesuits
Yep.
would work well. And then this is the stand-up EVA of David Scott, who also is 90. He's 92 years old. So there's two 90-year-old guys that did stand-up EVAs. That's, of course, us during the Gemini, Apollo 9, I mean, test of the lunar module that's docked there. And Rusty Schweikert went out on the porch of the lunar module for another EVA, stand-up EVA there of sorts. So what an interesting time we live in, George.
I'm telling you,
It's
happening again.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about when everybody's coming back, but we've got 19 humans orbiting the Earth for another day. The Chinese are going to stay up there till about November. Butch and Sunny, February. Crew 9's coming back probably a week after the Crew Dragon 9 docks up there. And then also the Soyuz MS-25 is coming back sometime in early October, I think. So exciting time. It is not easy to keep up with everything right now.
Yep.
Really is.
Yeah,
so
we were over at the Cape today, and it's humming over there. You can feel
what was going on at the Cape?
We were just touring some of the old launch pads, but just so much activity going on. A couple of boosters coming in on barges.
Yeah, you said you saw the Falcon 9 booster coming in.
I understand they're loading up the VAB right now with components. So we tried to get in.
Artemis components.
Yeah, we tried to get in, but no, we're too busy.
Yeah, they do have. They just got the, of course, they got the core stage in. And what did I see the other day that was brought in? Not the service module. Of course, the boosters, solid rocket boosters are already in there, but one of the other elements is it's going to be a year from November, if that, for the next Artemis 2 launch.
Right.
But it's still a lot of steps to go to make it work on there. So, got George Leopold here with me, science writer, and appreciate all your comments there, Terrence Jacobus. Can't answer all that here and do our program the way we're planning it, but yes, everything is a lot like a scuba diver's situation. If you've used those dry suits, and they deal with the radiation with a lot of protective layers of spacesuit. That's what this was all about, was testing some of the radiation materials that are going to have to be used on a trip to Mars.
Right, long-term
we're on there. So, talking about before we get into your book and everything here, tell everybody out there who's not been in our space museum your impression of our humble American Space Museum here.
It's great. It's an amazing collection.
Yeah, please speak up a little bit.
Amazing collection of from the very beginning, even including the Soviet program.
Yeah.
I'd seen stuff, and I thought I'd seen everything. I saw a lot of stuff that I've never seen before, and I compliment you on how you present it. Very engaging. Your docents are guys like Gary Elgire, they've got stories like you wouldn't believe. So,
well, we have space workers who are docents.
Yeah,
there. Very, very few of them, like me, weren't space workers.
You and I, right? Right.
We've got a test project engineer, Eric Baker. He's usually here on Mondays, and Wednesday is Gordon's. Gordon is an exception on there. We've got Barry Smith, on Wednesdays. Barry was a Goddard Webb telescope and Apollo
Yeah.
engineer.
Yeah.
And then Gary Allgaier, who does wonderful shows with us here.
Yeah.
And
Man, so important to preserve this.
it is. But also, we love having a landing pad for these people to kind of call home and get the love they deserve from
Yeah.
just the space
Yeah.
fans out there.
Absolutely.
Well, let's look at the cover of your book here. Tell us, tell us where we can buy it. What's what's the publisher pitch on this?
My publisher was Purdue University, which was Gus Grissom's alma mater, as well as Roger Chaffee's. The first edition came out in 2016, and it took me about 7 years to write it, nights and weekends. And the motivation behind this was that all of the Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, at least most of them had gotten to write their memoirs, and it occurred to me that, of course, Gus did not. He did publish a book on Gemini, and he had a ghostwriter. It was published posthumously. But I thought we needed to fill this gap in the history of the early space program, and make the point about how important his contributions were. He didn't consider himself a hero, but he did consider himself a pioneer.
Mm-hmm.
What's over the next hill? That's what drove these guys. And Gus was badly portrayed in the film The Right Stuff. The sequence at the end of his flight is, as far as I can tell, is pure fiction, and making Gus Grissom look like he couldn't complete his sentence is nonsense. He was very articulate. He chose his words carefully. When he spoke, people would listen because he was the best engineer of the original 7 astronauts, and his record speaks for itself. The maiden flight on Gemini, otherwise known as the Gusmobile,
right,
and the maiden flight on Apollo.
Right. You want the best test pilots for these things.
Within 18 months. Most test pilots wouldn't get one maiden flight in their entire career. Gus Grissom got 2 in 18 months. So that gives you...
just missed the Mercury maiden flight by Alan Shepard.
The flip of a coin. I guess you had to be in the Navy to get
that. It probably helped. Those of you that don't know your space history, and that's fine because we love catching it up here. Gus Grissom, of course, one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts that I had on my wall as a preteen, probably. Or I don't know where I got the picture. Probably cut him out of the National Geographic or Life magazine or something. But one of the original 7 Mercury astronauts, Alan Shepard and John Glenn were definitely the top 3 of the 7 who were going to get the first flight, and Alan Shepard did, and then Gus repeated that, and then of course John Glenn did the first orbit around of an American. And so Gus was always kind of like in the middle there like that,
Yeah, sort of lost.
And he probably didn't mind not having the full attention.
No, he didn't. He said, I don't give a whit about, he didn't say whit, but he didn't give a whit about, going to the White House and parades and all of that. He just wanted to go on to the next flight. He loved to go fast. He worked hard, as Mike Collins said on the 50th anniversary of the fire. If you wanted to find Gus Grissom, just go down to the factory floor, and there you would find him. He loved machines, and he had to understand how they worked. Mm-hmm. And that's why the Gemini spacecraft is always called the Gusmobile. And this is during Mercury, I believe.
Yeah, great.
And he was trying to take all of those lessons and transfer them to Apollo. And different contractors, and it became much more difficult, and a steps function increase in complexity, obviously, with the command module being
after his
complex.
Gemini 3 mission with the rookie John Young,
the great John Young,
of course. Think of how important he was to the Apollo program, that he wasn't slated to fly again.
Right.
He could have been a commander of another Gemini flight.
Yeah, he backed up 6. He was Capcom when Ed White was doing his spacewalk.
Uh-huh.
And someone told us the other day they emphasized to Ed White and McDivitt, are you getting pictures? They really wanted pictures because, Leonov's
Right, yeah.
was his grainy film, and those pictures of Ed White
Oh, McDivitt.
are iconic.
Yeah, Jim McDivitt under one of the best space photographers, really. He
Yeah.
really nailed it
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
There's some other missions that you wish they'd had better pictures.
Yeah.
Apollo 10 is one.
Yeah.
Just not very great photography by Stafford and Cernan.
Yeah.
And Young on that one. But
and Mike Collins losing his camera on Gemini 10 during the spacewalk.
Spacewalk, as Nikon floated away on there, in there. So appreciate y'all commenting there, Terrence. We appreciate your comments here, buddy. But we're not. We're talking about Gus Grissom here, so try and keep your thoughts to our guest here today. And we welcome your comments, though. And the rest of you out there, you got something for George to talk about, please do. We want to talk a little bit about one. Who was your source? Where? Of course, you and I were teenagers when he died.
Yeah.
So, who are the sources of your book?
Well, Lowell Grissom, who's a good friend of the museum, was an invaluable source in terms of Gus's early life, the family in Mitchell, Indiana. How does a guy from this obscure little town in southern Indiana literally rise to the top of the Right Stuff pyramid? There's Lowell.
There's Lowell with Anita Truex, our office manager there.
Betty Grissom neither approved or disapproved of my project. I didn't get any interviews with her, but I was there in Mitchell for the 50th anniversary of Liberty Bell 7 and spoke with her briefly and listened to her responses to other questions. And in the book, I sort of try to unpack the fraught history of the Grissom family with NASA. Of course, Betty sued North American Aviation after the fire, and in so doing sort of isolated herself from the other, the space community. And it's a complicated story, and I tried to unpack it. And yeah, there's a human toll here. And we'll talk about the Apollo 1 fire in a little bit. And, this shattered these 3 families. They've had to live with this for the rest of their lives. And, my thinking was I want to write this guy's story. I literally went to Gus Grissom's grave at Arlington Cemetery when I was living in Northern Virginia. I said, by God, I'm going to write this guy's biography.
Well, that's awesome because not what happened that I saw a Roger Chaffee documentary.
Yeah.
Did you see that about
Yes.
the sculpture that's in Grand Rapids in there?
Yes.
But it was also from one of the daughters talking about that she basically felt like NASA wrote him a check and forgot about him.
Yeah, sure.
And this is 1967. So there weren't things like grief counselors and this whole stuff that happens today. But she feels very strongly. This is the daughter of Roger Chaffee and Cheryl Chaffee, who's I've talked to her personally about this. And she just kind of felt like, today they would be handled much better, but she and her brother and mother were just kind of left alone. Nobody called up their phone anymore to check in on them except a few close friends.
Yeah.
And it took a mental toll on them.
Yeah. I mean, in the very early days with the original Mercury astronauts, I mean, the wives particularly, I mean, the men sort of learned from John Glenn, who was expert at PR, but the wives had to, figure this out on their own.
Yeah.
And they simply weren't prepared. All of a sudden your husband's been named an astronaut and there are camera crews in your front yard. What am I supposed to do? And they had to, and the Grissoms were hardworking Hoosiers. They didn't like to draw attention to themselves. And my conclusion was that they were ordinary people who did extraordinary things. And I think that's what Gus represents.
Absolutely, and we're talking about Mitchell, Indiana. That's the middle on the east side of the state, I believe, a little
Yeah, a
bit.
couple hours west and a little north of Louisville.
Yeah, but there's a place called French Lick that's nearby
Oh yes,
that has a statue there to a basketball player.
Larry Bird.
Larry Bird, yeah. So if you're going to go to Mitchell, Indiana, you got to go to French Lick and see the statue. And I've
Yeah,
never seen either,
yeah,
and that's on my bucket list to see that. Though
yeah.
I've been to a bunch of Indianapolis 500s, I was never in the mood to stop.
During book tour I was all over Indiana.
Uh-huh.
I know Indiana almost as well as I know my home state of Wisconsin.
Well, I grew up in Findlay, Ohio, across the border from Fort Wayne.
Okay.
Basically, up
Okay.
in there. So we listened to Whoa Whoa Radio growing up a lot there. So enjoying this conversation with George Leopold. Didn't meet him before a couple days ago, but like so many of you space friends out there, an instant connection between the two of us because we love this kind of space history, and we know you do too. Wanted to give a little shout out to somebody else that, by the way, that's Lowell in front of his brother's flight suit that he wore in Gemini 3 that we proudly have. Lowell
great.
comes every end of January to celebrate his brother and crewmates.
A real gentleman.
Yes,
A real
gentleman.
gentleman.
He worked for McDonald in the PR department, and I've met him now 5 or 6 years in a row. Couldn't believe it this year when I turned around. He had that cool Gus Mobile sweatshirt on.
Yeah, right.
And they called it the Gus Mobile because Gus really had a. He said where we're going to put this panels here, and I want this over by my feet down here. And of course they're talking like jet fighter pilots and the urgency that they have to know where things are without even just so intuitive. Correct, George?
Yeah, it was the Corvette of spacecraft, and what they did on Mercury, the spacecraft would be shipped from McDonald in St. Louis, and once it got to the Cape, they'd pull it apart and start testing, and then they'd have to put all this stuff back together again. One of the things that Gus promoted on Gemini was a modular approach where you could take out certain components without ripping the whole spacecraft apart in order to test or verify that something was working. And it was a beautiful spacecraft. It worked every time. They weren't crazy about the ejection seats, but
No.
luckily they never had to use them.
Right. Particularly after being bathed for 3 hours in 100% oxygen.
Yeah.
And then you ignite a torch beneath your seat.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. And we'll probably be talking a little bit later about pure oxygen.
That was,
and we were extremely fortunate in the previous 16 flights.
Yeah. That's what Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford thought when they were on their Gemini 6 abort. That we're just going to be a big old flaming ball of fire coming out of here.
I believe Stafford said crispy critters.
Yeah, crispy critters is what Stafford said exactly on there. Wanted to show off a place that honors the Grissom memory. Tell us where this is.
This is Earl Mullins Museum in Bonne Terre, Missouri. I was there the day that the ribbon was cut. Lowell and Babette and Scott Grissom were there to cut the ribbon.
There's Earl.
Yep, and Lowell told me that this fellow named Earl Mullins came up to him one day and he said, "By God, I'm gonna build a museum to Gus Grissom." And Lowell said, "Well, good luck with that." And as the 400,000 people of Apollo did, he did what he said he would do. It's a beautiful museum. It's very important. It's that was an old mining town, and the economy's pretty rough there. But Earl loves his community. This is an important. It's sort of a centerpiece on Main Street. And he's got a lot of great stuff. He's got a moon rock.
He's got a moon rock?
because the NASA came to each of the families and offered them, we will place a moon rock in any museum of your choice. And Lowell said that Earl's museum is good enough, it's secure enough, which is another thing.
Yeah, that's huge.
And so they have a moon rock on display. And
Great.
Earl's got lots of all kinds of Gus Grissom materials, all kinds of stuff from Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, shuttle. And I encourage anybody, if you're in the St. Louis area, it's about an hour south of there. Earl's done a great job.
Earl, good to see you, buddy. When I met him a couple, maybe about a year ago now. Let's go forward there with, there he is with.
Yeah, he's Lowell's travel companion.
Would you give me, Selvin, on my desk there, I've got the green notebook, and I've got the name of these gentlemen. It's Kent, and yeah, that's it, buddy. Thank you there. That's Dan Green is seated there with his son Kent, and Dan was a Gemini era worker, or not worker. He was a boss at McDonald in St. Louis there.
Yeah.
And there's Earl above my head with Lowell Grissom there, Earl Mullins there, and we actually did an interview with the father and son, Dan Green and Kent. It was quite interesting.
Yeah.
Dan had a lot of stories about Mr. McDonald himself.
Mr. Mac. Yeah.
Mr. Mac, what an influence he was.
And back then, these guys lived with the spacecraft. They were on the floor all the way through before it was shipped to the Cape. And, that was one of the things that was more difficult to do when they switched to North American for the Apollo command module.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Tom Stafford always made that point about how during Gemini, each crew lived with that spacecraft all the way through the assembly and testing process before it was shipped to the Cape.
Uh-huh. All right. We appreciate you all comments, but don't comment about stuff we're not talking about here. And we understand there's a lot of space history that can be questioned. And so you're just kind of filling up space there and detracting from this great guest that we have here. We can take up some of these other things on future Stay Curious, is okay? But Bruce Jacobs, who's our IT guy, said, did you ever hear Sam Bedingfield's story about flying with Gus in the Air Force and Gus falling asleep?
Yes. Yeah.
You did?
Yeah. I spoke to Sam a couple of times.
Sam Bedingfield, badge number 4
Yeah.
Of NASA. Alphabetically, they were dished out.
Yeah.
A great friend of Gus Grissom.
Yeah,
we have on the wall in there, if you've read that.
Yes, I saw it.
Where Sam got a job. He was a tobacco farmer in North Carolina, hated it. He had a Purdue engineering degree. He fell down here into the rocket business, and he called up his buddy Gus Grissom and said, hey, why don't you come down here and work? Gus called up Sam. Gus called up Sam.
To go up there to work at Langley.
Yeah. Yes. And Sam Bedingfield famously says, I don't know anything about rockets, to which Gus Grissom said,
they don't have anybody here who does.
And
so he said, cross the runway, you'll probably get hired.
So what's the story there that Bruce is alluding to?
So Gus and Sam were at Wright Pat together, and I think they were flying escort for some test, and then the test didn't work out, and they figured, well, we're already airborne, let's take the aircraft out, and two-seater obviously, and Gus said, Sam, you want to fly it? You want to take it for a while? Said, yeah, sure. Okay, so they're going along, and Sam's having a great time, and he's watching the fuel gauge, and it's getting a little low, and they probably need to start turning back, and Gus goes, look at the gauge, and Gus isn't answering. So Sam's getting nervous, so he's shaking the wings to see if he can wake Gus up.
Oh, really?
And Gus, he's sound asleep. And said, Gus, we got to try. And Gus just said, I'll take it. And, no emergency. He just turned around, came in. They had a couple 100 pounds of fuel left, nothing to it.
Huh.
And then Sam realized, okay, this guy knows how to fly. He's fearless. He's faced with what could be a really dangerous situation. cool as a cucumber.
Well, let's get into your book here. Is that story in the book?
Oh yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
is it?
yeah.
Okay. All right. There you go.
Spoke with Sam.
Well,
Great,
Bruce is
really
great
nice guy.
friends with the Bedingfield family,
Yeah.
and the daughter married Matthias is they're just been great on there. So
Yeah.
thanks for bringing that up there, Bruce. Also, John Borelli says that he likes the supersized version of me today. I was a mini Mark yesterday, but we just had some challenges through the day. Um, let's see. Dean Babcock's got a story. A question that's apropos. Dean, as usual, on the ball there. Let's talk about the Apollo 1 fire. You all know the problems with it. That famously, Gus said they had communication problems, and he said, "How can we talk from Earth to the moon if we can't talk between two buildings?"
3 buildings.
3 buildings.
Yeah.
And then something happened.
Yeah, that was before the Cola fire. That was the last transmission from the crew, aside from what came over the Black Channel 3 between the crew members.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So, Dean Babcock's question is, and you can answer it now or later, the day of the fire, was there any discussion of ending the test early that day and just start fresh the next day?
I think there were people who wanted to do that, but they wanted to get through this test. I mean, the launch date had slipped at least once before then, maybe twice. Technically, probably twice. So they were slated to launch on February 21st, 1967. And not only were they going to do this launch simulation with the hatches closed, called plugs out test, where they would pull the umbilicals at T-0. Gus also wanted to practice the egress drill after they got out of the spacecraft. In fact, Sam Bedingfield was just coming back from dinner back to the pad, and he was gonna run that test. Gus wanted to get all of this stuff out of the way so they'd be ready to fly. So I think, once you do these tests, these guys were very reluctant to have to stop and then repeat the whole thing over again. We'll just wait for this hold to, resuming the count, and let's get this finished because we've gotten this far. I mean, they were in the spacecraft for over 5 hours at that point, and I think they just wanted to get it
They
done.
call it plugs out test famously.
Yeah,
where they're
right. So
mimicking in a way.
right, which means the spacecraft is the hatches are sealed. They've pumped the spacecraft with pure oxygen. Obviously the crew is in their suits with the visors down, and so it's a full launch simulation. No propellants in the booster, so this test was not considered hazardous. And what's apparent to us is that literally no one saw this scenario coming.
Plus, the escape tower's fueled, though.
Yes.
Above it there. That was a lucky thing that escape tower didn't catch fire.
Solid rocket launch escape system above them. The only thing that saved them, and one of the few safety steps that was taken that night, was that those 4 nozzles on that launch escape system were capped. If the flames had hit high enough, that would have taken out the entire pad.
Wow, and another 20 people with it.
Yeah, right, right.
Of course, I've heard many stories being part of this museum from the old timers who were there. People like Ernie Rios.
Yeah.
The great John Tribe, who's still with us. Ernie passed away.
Yeah.
You've talked to John Tribe, I know.
Yeah, we had lunch with him the other day. He's doing very well.
And great British import during the Apollo era, hypersonics expert. John's been on the show several times.
Yeah, and a key guy to keep the memory of all of this stuff alive, right?
Ernie and John weren't too affected by it because they shared. I mean, I know they're affected by it, but there's some people that don't even want to talk about it, George.
Yeah.
Their eyes just glaze over. And I hear the stories of them down at the Mousetrap having dinner that Friday night.
Right.
And the owner come up as the band was playing. A big band, by the way, was playing down at the Mousetrap that Friday night,
I did
January 27th, 1967.
Yeah.
And the owner said, we've had a problem at the pad.
Yeah.
We've lost our astronauts. And women have told me they never heard a man sob
Yeah.
and cry before.
Yeah. Yeah.
But tears just echoed in his whole room.
Yeah.
And one of the band members played softly "Fly Me to the Moon" as everybody was
Wow.
singling out there. That's
Wow.
a arm-raising goosebump story
Yeah,
every
definitely.
time I tell it. But
Definitely.
you know, you think of things like this. I've heard other secretaries say they would be at the office the next day or the next 2 days, and they would hear men just bawling at
Mhm.
their desks.
John Tribe told, and two things about John Tribe. He said, did he just say fire? He was in the operations building. He wasn't in the blockhouse. He was in the but he was working on RCS protocols, the reaction control system. And when he turned to the guy next to him and said, did he say fire? I mean, nobody can
Yeah.
conceive of this. What's going on? What did he say? The other thing John mentioned was that while they were disassembling the spacecraft after the fire and taking it to the pyrotechnics building, for 2 weeks, there were the red, white, and blue Corvettes of Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee sat in the parking lot
Oh my!
before they were taken away.
For 2 weeks, wow,
Yeah.
that's something else. They were taken away after they were buried at Arlington. And,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you know, Ed White at West Point, I believe. Right?
Yeah, right. Yeah,
there.
January 30th, right.
Well, you share this story with you. I just wanted to share what what you'll never hear from anybody else about the pathos of this for the space workers.
Yeah, I mean it's important, and so back up a little bit. When you publish a book, everybody asks, so what are you working on now? We are here. My colleague Matthew Bedingfield, no relation to Sam,
Yeah.
but he's the grandson of James Gleaves, who was on level A8 on pad 34 on the night of the fire and helped remove the hatches. We're trying to write a definitive account of the fire. Matthew's a sharp young guy. He's younger than my son. He's been all over the country, hitting as many of the archives as we possibly can. We spent a lot of time at the National Archives in suburban DC. One day, we were folding through, and this is what researchers do. You try to turn every page. And we were looking through a series of photographs, and he found a picture of his grandfather who had accompanied the burned out spacecraft 012, the Apollo 1 command module, from the Cape all the way up to Langley. They took it up in a barge, and he was selected because he helped disassemble it. He was selected to take it up to Langley.
Ride the barge.
Yep, they
Wow.
went up the intercoastal waterway, and
Amazing.
and and we found a picture of the barge arriving at the dock at Langley, ready to take possession of the spacecraft. And that's one of the things that we want to do, is we want to trace the Apollo Block 1 command module designated spacecraft 012 from its design, its development, its turnover to the customer, from North American Aviation to NASA, its shipment here, the testing, the vacuum chamber test, all of these things, the fire, the disassembly, and ultimately, you could say its demise, but now we want people to understand how this thing was built, the serious mistakes that were made, the lessons that it taught to NASA and North American. And it became an article of faith that if the Apollo 1 fire had not happened, we probably wouldn't have gotten to the moon by the end of the 1960s, as President Kennedy had declared.
Mm-hmm.
That became an article of faith. George Lowe said it, Gene Kranz said it, Chris Kraft said it. And these guys, once they got over the enormous shock of what happened, they fixed it. George Lowe was instrumental in like the 1700 design changes to the spacecraft. They meet every Friday. This one I approve. No, we won't do this. They fix the spacecraft. They change the pure oxygen atmosphere under pressure to air, to what we breathe on the ground, and then as the spacecraft would reach orbit, the nitrogen would bleed off, and they switch from an inward opening cork hatch to this great hatch that would open in 3 seconds. And there's a great display at the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Center of those 3 Block 1 hatches. I mean, the inner hatch was a cork and it weighed about 40 pounds. And it was replaced by this great design that you could get out in 3 seconds. If they'd had it, they would have survived. And I just saw an interview with Jim McDivitt, and the sort of the narrative has always been, well, we wouldn't have had any of these changes without the fire. And that's not quite true. McDivitt points out that, first of all, he switched from the commander of the backup crew to what became Apollo 9. And they, of course, they were going to do EVA on Apollo 9. He couldn't do an EVA on Block 1 because that hatch was down so tight, because they wanted to have a good seal. And then there are other issues with Gus and hatches that your audience knows about. But McDivitt said, no, that's not true. We had that hatch ready to go on the block too. So it was on the drawing board. It was something that North American Aviation, to its credit, had been pushing all along. And North American Aviation had also been warning NASA, don't go with a pure oxygen atmosphere under pressure on the pad. It's too dangerous. And that combination with all of these flammable materials, much of which was placed in it by the astronauts, and all you needed was a spark. And they never had a chance. But nobody conceived of this scenario. They were all worried about something happening during the boost phase or in orbit. Nobody thought about what happens if you pump this thing with 16.7 psi of pure oxygen on the pad and seal the hatches. And 15 miles of bad wiring. It seems so obvious today, but it was like there was this groupthink attitude at the time, and they'd been very successful, 16 previous flights.
Right.
So there was some hubris, maybe some complacency, but there was also the thing that your audience is, I'm sure, familiar with, go fever. It was this groupthink attitude that, we know best. We don't have to communicate up and down. And, 3 guys paid the ultimate price because of that.
Absolutely. Jim McDivitt, one of the really unsung astronaut heroes in my mind. He, after Apollo 9 command, could have commanded Apollo 12 or 13. That was been the sequence for him to go to the moon. Right. And instead, he become the manager of the whole Apollo program. So what you're saying, he was saying as a manager then instead of an astronaut. At that time. But enjoying this conversation with George Leopold. There is the Block 1. Got a question from Dean Babcock. How many Block 1 command modules were actually constructed?
So there was another one being tested on the same day. That was spacecraft 014. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure because while they were getting ready for the Apollo 1 launch, I mean, they had already started work on the Block 2. It may have been a handful. I know of one more, which was 014, and 014 was brought back here during the investigation so that they could compare, the wiring that's now gone. This is where it was. And in fact, a guy named Gary Johnson came out.
There is that wiring.
Did a lot of that.
That you mentioned.
Yeah, the wiring was terrible. It was machine bundled, all kinds of exposed.
Red area showing you this. This is from Gary Allgeier's talk.
Gary's done a lot of good work on this.
Gary, a structural engineer for Apollo and Shuttle. Gary did a great program on Apollo 1. Just Google Gary's name or Apollo 1 on the over 800 episodes of Stay Curious now on YouTube. But this is looking at the back, and there was a lot of stuff they could step on.
Yeah.
Uh,
A lot of wiring on the floor. I mean, Gary makes this point about the umbilical being on the wrong side,
yeah,
and the wiring has to go along the floor to the instrument panels in the lower equipment bay. And it seems obvious now that that was a bad design, but then they changed it according to Gary
yeah, rerouted on the other
on the
side.
black too, and he would know
Yeah.
because he worked on
It'd be
it.
like taking an extension cord around your shed and plugging it in through a window or
Right.
something.
So that jogs my memory, and in reference to the question we got, so there was a block one that flew on Apollo 6,
Okay.
and Gary found it in a museum in Atlanta.
Yes. Yeah, that's
So
right.
so that's two that
He's
I
trying
know.
to get you and him to go in and scurry around inside of
I
it.
know. I would love to do that. So
Oh,
that's
he'll get it. He'll do it.
so there's 04 the space 014 and that one. So there were probably a couple of others to answer your listener's question.
Uh-huh. Good. Let's go here to
And of course, none of them, except for that unmanned flight, actually left the ground.
right. Exactly there. Did you notice our Block 1 emergency egress manual in our case in there? Yeah. That's signed by Bedingfield and Deke Slayton and Patron and that's one of the more valuable things we have here in this museum.
Right,
It's maybe 10 of those were made.
Yeah,
Talking about a manual that when you opened it up, it's like different. The whole pages layout is a fold out, big print, and are the astronauts incapacitated? If they are, get them out, put them on the gurney, push the button, the elevator, all that kind of stuff.
Every scenario you can think of.
Yeah,
Yeah.
was in there, and of course there was nothing that they could do with this tragedy here. There's the gentleman in the spacecraft there.
Yeah, it's a good shot. I think this might be from a vacuum chamber.
That's
test.
Gary's. I've showed this because after Gary Allgire's talk on this Stay Curious program this year about this, I'll never look at this picture again the same.
In the same way. Yeah.
That is Ed White in the middle. The red arrow there points to where he had to reach back. That's the door. That's the hatch behind Ed
That's
White.
the
there.
inward opening hatch.
And
Yep.
he had to, inside that pouch is the tool. So he had to open the hatch. So he had to open that tool bag, grab the hatch, grab the tool, then lift the tool up behind his head, the bag up, and that's where the ratchet socket was to start ratcheting
The hatch was dogged down. Yeah.
Yeah. And to do that, he would have to turn around, and as you see, he's got hoses on him there that he would have had to have disengaged to be able to turn around and undo the hatch.
Yeah, that's his suit circuit. Right?
What a lot to ask in an emergency.
And meanwhile, the commander, Gus Grissom, on the right, has got to lower his headrest so he can actually lean back and do that.
Yeah.
And that is exactly what I think happened. I wrote an account of the fire in the Gus Grissom biography, and from what I was able to determine was that Gus Grissom was able to hit the pressure dump valve, even though it was a wall of flame was coming at him. And I've heard, and I could confirm this if they let me in to see the spacecraft, I heard that he actually hit it so hard, it was like a gear shift, that he hit it so hard that he snapped it. And my colleague Matthew Bedingfield's grandfather, Jim Gleaves, says that he heard a whoosh just before the pressure vessel burst. You know, it reached, I think, over 20 psi, and the pressure vessel erupted. And that was probably Gus dumping the cabin pressure, but the orifice on that thing was never designed to handle that much pressure on the pad. So, you know, it didn't really do any good. And Ed White, despite the fact that he was almost an Olympian, nobody could have opened that hatch with all of that internal pressure pushing on that cork hatch.
Yeah, he missed the Olympics in
Yeah.
running or something.
Yeah, right. He almost made the
tenth of a
Olympic team
second
in
or
the 50s.
something.
Yeah, great athlete.
Yeah, and Roger Chaffee, just one of the whiz kids of the Apollo era, would have been
Yep.
a
Another Purdue,
moonwalker commander.
another
That's
Boilermaker. Yeah,
right. 24 Purdue knots out there. We love seeing them
that's right.
out there at the Kennedy Space Center Visitors Complex out there. Well, hope you have enjoyed this conversation with George. We're winding it up here a little bit. You to just say anything you want to say. There's kind of a
Yeah,
unusual picture of the great crew there.
yeah. So they must be heading up to the pad. They're not. They don't have their helmets on, so we're not exactly when this photograph
There
was
was a
taken.
sequence of those I saw.
Yeah, right. Yeah, because obviously on the day of the fire they would be suited up. We would have pre-breathed oxygen in
Hmm.
their suit loops. So this must have been an earlier test, or it could have been the day when they took sort of the famous pictures that everybody's seen.
I think that's the famous
That may
picture
be,
day.
yeah.
Yeah.
They come out and they're
Uh,
carrying their air conditioners and they got to pose for the fire. And
the
Gus hated doing that stuff, but at this point, he from a PR standpoint, he was becoming pretty savvy as to what the media's requirements were. He wasn't good at giving sound bites, but he understood that this was, especially if you're the commander, it's necessary that you have to sit down and do these interviews and explain to the space media, what's the goal of this mission? What do we hope to do? And in fact, he sort of gave a hint at the last big press conference in Houston in mid-December of '66. A reporter asked him, "What would you consider a successful first mission?" And it could have gone as long as 2 weeks. And he said, "If we all get back alive." And everyone laughed, but he was actually sending a signal because he knew he had a pretty bad spacecraft on his hand. But the attitude of these guys was that we can fix this. We can fly the crate that the thing came in. And if I don't if I don't take this flight, there are 10 guys behind me who'll jump on it.
Oh yeah.
So he kind of played the hand that he was dealt. And there's the famous story about him hanging a lemon on the simulator.
Yeah.
About a week before the fire, and he knew that.
Picture of him praying over it.
Yeah, right. The
picture.
picture they autographed. That was during the customer review in August of '66. They presented that picture to Joe Shea, who was he ran the Apollo program out of Houston, and they said, it's not that we don't trust you, Joe, but we thought we'd go over your head.
Mm-hmm.
That was sort of an illustration of Gus's mischievous and sometimes a little dark sense of humor, and a little bit of a fatalist too, I think.
Gary Gerald, one of our great watchers, asked, "How did Gus get interested in aviation?"
Well, he wasn't, wasn't the standard thing where he was building model airplanes and watching who was the cartoon character. The space guy, I forget his name.
Any of the space guys, Captain. You and our boat.
Our listeners are not having a moment like we are.
Right.
They know who we're talking about. But so
Buck Rogers.
Buck Rogers. Yeah.
Buck Rogers.
Yeah. So he was interested in going fast. He was always interested in machines. A self-starter, a hard worker. He was an average student, but he had very clear mathematics and sort of physics science skills. He just wasn't really pushed very hard in Mitchell, and he after he came back from World War II, he never actually flew in World War II. He barely got into Purdue University on the GI Bill because he messed around too much in high school, and his grades weren't very good. But once he got to Purdue, he buckled down. He got a mechanical engineering degree in 3.5 years.
Is that right?
And flew in Korea. He flew 100 missions in Korea, re-up for 25 more, and they said, no, we need you to go home. and train pilots. And Gus said sometimes training these pilots was more dangerous than combat. He had a couple of close
Try those
calls.
Sabre F-86
Yeah,
planes in there.
right,
Oh,
right.
there's a beautiful picture of the man.
There's old Gus. Yep, smiling.
Would he have been the first man on the moon?
It depends. So at this point, Shepard was grounded. Deke Slayton wanted a Mercury 7 astronaut to get the first crack, but of course everything had to go in the proper sequence, and no one could have foreseen in 1966, 1967 that there would be the fire. They'd have the all-up test on Apollo 4, which means you now have a vehicle that can reach the moon, but you're not sure that whether the spacecraft is going to work. And then Shiraz Apollo 7 mission proves that the command and service module are flight worthy, but gee, the lunar module's not ready. What are we going to do on the next flight? Why repeat what Apollo 7 does? So they decide, let's go around the moon. So everything has to fall in place. You have to be in the right spot in the crew selection process. And as it turns out, it wasn't Gus Grissom, but it was this other guy named Neil Armstrong, who happened to just be a backup on, if you're the backup on 9, that means you get to command 11, or no, whatever was 3 back from 11, 8. And he just happened to be in the right sequence. And it turns out Neil Armstrong was obviously the ideal candidate. But there was, during a press conference, I think it was the same one in December, or it might have been when the crew was announced in March of '66. This sort of illustrated Gus Grissom's sense of humor. Some reporter said, so if you land on the moon, which one of you will be the first one to go down the ladder? And there was a lot of talking back and forth, and Gus said, well, it'll be me and one other guy.
Yeah, very interesting, boy. Just to have met Lowell Grissom, his brother. Oh my gosh, what a great nice man, and how he carries his brother's legacy. And I wish I'd had foresight to get the business card. You know what Lowell's business card is?
No.
It's the emblem of Apollo 1, and it says, "Don't remember Gus, Ed, and Roger." That's his business card.
Yeah, Gus was very fortunate to have a kid brother like Lowell Grissom, who's he's worked for 50 years tirelessly to keep the memory of his brother and Ed White and Roger Chaffee's memory alive. And so the folks who are going to go into space today understand they're standing on the shoulders of giants who gave the ultimate sacrifice. And I emphasize the theme in my book is risk. They understood the risks. They did everything that they could to minimize those risks before they fly. But you have to accept some risk or you're never going to fly. And he understood that. And there's a famous quote, if we die, it's worth the risk. I was never actually able to track down where, when, and to whom he said that.
Oh, okay.
And I'm not sure that
urban legend.
He did say things very similar to that. But one thing I know that he did say, and this is classic Gus Grissom, if I die, throw a party and then go back to work. I mean, that sums up his life and his career and his legacy, wow. I think.
Well, that's a great way to sum up our conversation with you, George. I know we've sold a couple books here for you. I'm going to be ordering
If only it wasn't out of print.
Is it available?
It's available, yeah. There are copies floating around. There was a paperback, or there was the hardcover.
Amazon paperback covers.
Yeah, so Purdue put out a hardcover in 2016, and we did an updated version of the book in 2018. I'm sure you can find it on Amazon, yeah, but it's been out of print for a couple of years, which for an author is a good sign because it means they sold it out.
Tom Celentano said he met Lowell once here at the museum here on there, and I know that you enjoyed this show, Tom. He's a proud Connecticut follower of us up there, and we thank everybody for following us today. And I certainly appreciate George calling me at the last minute. I was going to do shuttles of the month of September, but I'll do that tomorrow.
I was just
As
across the Indian River and was happy
That's
to
great.
come over.
Not only do we have 19 humans in space, but I think tomorrow, for the next 4 days, at one time, were the most shuttles that have orbited the Earth. 7 shuttles orbited the Earth in the months of September, from September 12th to 16th.
Wow.
With 47 astronauts on board.
Yeah.
And I love juxtaposing history with that, just like I love talking about our heroes of the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo program there. George, you're always
Mark,
welcome to come back.
a pleasure.
And we'll do maybe a Google Meets with you on the road someday here.
Love to do that when
But
the
I'm
next
glad
one.
you got to see the museum, and good luck to you and Matthew. We'll be
Thank you.
following
Thank
what
you.
you're all doing there. And until next time, stay healthy and keep writing that 1,000 words a day or whatever
There you
you're
go.
wanting
Yep.
to do.
That's what we're doing.
In there. Selvin, thank you for a great Streamlabs job today, and thank you, Marty Winkel, for masking up and coming in here to help us out at the last minute. This is why I brought Marty in, so we could have a terrific show with George, and I enjoyed it as much as you did. Tomorrow will be Friday. We'll be talking about current events and those shuttles and space history in September. Until then, I'm Marquette saying I can't wait to see you in our museum to bridge the space between us. Cheers to you, George.